Oh, good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Nasongo. I teach international studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And my presentation this morning is on mapping the theoretical and conceptual terrain of the political science study of Africa. And in terms of the premise, I proceed from the idea that the main focus of political science research on Africa has been the problematic of development. And yet this problematic of development, or the process of development, has proceeded within a context of political, economic, and social oppression. And therefore you have two trajectories in terms of political science study of Africa. Whereas political science research that focuses on the problematic of development has given epistemological priority to generation of empirical political knowledge, the research emphasis on the problematic of emancipation from oppression and exploitation prioritizes an epistemological conception of knowledge that facilitates radical change because of the kind of questions that this approach raises. Now, in terms of how I proceed, number one, the purpose of my paper is to explore the nexus between the research that focuses on development and the research that focuses on emancipation, and how effective the production of knowledge via these approaches has been. I proceed by dividing the paper into three major sections. And the argument is that the relevance and implications of political science epistemologies generated by normative knowledge tends to be much more profound in terms of its transformational capacity, while the epistemologies generated by research that focuses mainly using empirical and positivist approaches produces knowledge that tends to be pro status quo. That is the argument that I make in my paper. And so I begin first by mapping out theoretical approaches that have knowingly been liberal in their approach. The first one, of course, is the modernization theory, started in the 1960s through the 1970s. I'm sure this is an approach that many of us are aware of. It is path dependent with economic, social, and political trajectories drawing from approaches from other disciplines. Now, the main argument of this approach is that all societies go through, of course, the same stages of development, and that African societies were expected to go through the same. All right? It really justified considerable increase in the allocation of governmental funds to social scientists, especially those working on development issues. And but what I find problematic about it is that it's based on the experience of Western countries, the experiences of Western countries and extrapolation of those experiences to African countries, which may be dismissed as being an anatomistic fallacy. Number two, the second were political order approaches that emerged in the the 1970s through the early 1980s. Now, this resulted from the fact that the expectations of modernization theory did not come to pass. All right, three major developments. Number one was the increase in insurgency movements on the continent. Number two was the level of military coups on the continent. And then number three was an external factor that was US-based in terms of the civil rights movement in the US and the protests against US involvement in Vietnam that led to a shift in focus from modernization on the part of Africa and elsewhere to issues of political order and stability. And so political science studies on the continent also started focusing on issues of political order, arguing that the process of modernization, in fact, does not necessarily lead to democracy, but it may lead to issues of political decay. In fact, 8 major crises were noted as a result of the process of development. 8 major crises, right? The crisis of identity, of legitimacy, of participation, of penetration, distribution, integration, national survival, and the crisis of external control. And so the prescription from the perspective of political order approaches was that you need political institutionalization. The logic was that, in fact, it is not the form of government that matters, but it is the degree of government. Now, the result of this, the knowledge generated from this, had the effect, in fact, of legitimizing authoritarianism in Africa and giving a lot of logic and philosophical support to the establishment of authoritarian regimes. Number three, within the liberal paradigm, were public policy process approaches, late 1970s through the 1980s. Now, this was born out of the critique of the theories that were being used then, that that political scientists were engaging in what was called grand theorizing, that you need to come down to the nitty-gritty of public policy making. And this is what led to the rise of this process that had two trajectories, the political economy approach and the public policy process. One focused on the idea of identifying the right policies for implementation on the part of Africa, the other one focusing on the impact and implications of the policies being adopted on the continent. And this impetus for the shift toward public policy perspectives was in fact an increasing emphasis on the role of the state in Africa, leading especially on the African continent on the rise of a lot of scholarship on what was being called Africa's lost decades. Number four, this comes from the mid-1990s through the 2010s, the contemporary period, the current period that we are in, which I notice is characterized by a liberal theoretical eclecticism, focusing on a myriad of themes from democratization to the role of ethnicity and conflict, to centering gender in the approach to the study of Africa, to the analysis of worst case scenarios of state collapse in Somalia, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, and so on, and to focusing on the individual African political leaders and what they have done on the continent. Then number three, or the third, are the critical approaches, all right, which I identify first as the dependency theory, which emerged in the late 1960s through the early 1970s with the writings of the likes of Gunda Frank, Rodney, Cardoso, Samir Amin, also Kamin. And the basic argument here being that the African continent was introduced to the world capitalist system from an unequal footing, and that the relations between the global north and the global south are essentially exploitative, and that they are structured to remain so forevermore until kingdom come. This was the basis of the dependence theory. And that this is as a result of the harmony of interests between what was called the center of the center and the center of the periphery. That the political class in Africa and the political and economic class in the developed world have a harmony of interests. And those interests are not consonant with the interests of the general populations on the African continent. And that this then explains why, in spite of the fact that that partnership is deleterious to the general interest of the majority of the people, it continues because it's a partnership between our political class here and the political elite from elsewhere. Then you have the world systems theory that emerged in the mid-1970s through the 1980s, which introduced a different, it's rooted in the dependence thing, but it introduced a third aspect to it. So the dependence school is dyadic, the division of the world into the center and the periphery. The world systems approach introduced what it called a semi-periphery, which then functions to kind of alleviate the perception of the division, the stark division between the core and the periphery. So you have semi-peripheries which are neither in the periphery nor are they in the core. So you have regional powers, Nigeria in West Africa, South Africa in the Southern African region, perhaps Kenya, right, in Eastern African region, which are seen to be developing, all right? And so the basic argument of the dependency theory was that you needed polarization of the relations between the periphery and the center. But the existence of the semi-periphery then blunts that kind of polarization, and therefore change will never come to pass. Then you had neo-Marxism as well. You had new critical research trends in the current system, for a critical review of the process of democratization, political economy approach, neo-imperialism, post-imperialism, and so on. The idea of engendering the social sciences, the study of social movements, but the most important in the critical tradition is the African nationalist school, which has focused on the notion that we need research on Africa by African scholars, and they need to generate networks within the continent that are capable of articulating the kind of research and recommendations that reflect the lived experience of African peoples. And this, I think, has been an effective leadership on the part of Codesria. Much of the scholarship generated within that has been within the critical tradition and focused on issues of African development. Finally, I have to have a say about the dialectic approach, which I find only one scholar has engaged in the use of the dialectics in this political study of Africa. And this is Professor Ali Mazrui. Very effective in analyzing issues from a dialectical perspective. Now, there are three laws of the dialectics. The law of the unity and the conflict of opposites, the law of the passage of quantitative change into qualitative change, and the law of the negation of the negation. Of these three laws, Mazrui has tended to apply the first one, the law of the unity and the conflict of opposites, in his analysis of the African social political situation. For example, back in 1966, he wrote a paper on Nkrumah as the Leninist Tsar, arguing that Nkrumah strove to be Africa's Lenin, a revolutionary theorist, while at the same time he sought to be Ghana's Tsar, an imperial ruler. A very effective way of analyzing things. That his strategy was, Nkrumah's tragedy was a tragedy of excess rather than of contradiction, that he tried to be too much of a revolutionary monarch. Here is another one. He argues that Africa is an Eden of lost innocence, while America is the Eden of current power and future fulfillment. Here he was focusing on the issue of how important a role Africa has played in the development of the US. And yet the US has more or less neglected Africa, and that both are actually Edens. The Eden of lost innocence, the Eden of fulfillment. Look, with regard to Nigeria and South Africa, he applies the same dialectical approach, arguing that Nigeria is the Africa of human resources, South Africa of mineral resources. Nigeria, repellent to European settlement, South Africa, a magnet of the same. Nigeria, monoracial society, South Africa, multiracial one. Nigeria, grappling with the politics of religion, South Africa, preoccupied with the politics of secularism. Nigeria, the largest exporter of oil, South Africa, the continent's largest consumer of oil, and on and on. Look, the idea that pan movements are born out of dream and nightmare, out of anguish and vision. This dialectical thing, the unity of opposites. And actually it's reflected in the natural phenomena. All natural things are said to be composed of a unity of opposites. If you look at physics, electricity, you have negative and positive electricity. You boil water, you freeze. In mechanics, you have the law of what? Action and reaction. In mathematics, you have the integral and you have the... I'm told my time is out. So let me conclude by again also pointing out that within the discipline of political science, it has been also at some times a discipline at war with each other. There is contestation between which methodologies are better, which ones are worse. So you have the one that focuses on empiricism, positivist orientation, arguing that we should, as political scientists, only focus on things that we can measure, things that we can see, things that are tangible, while others argue that we need to also focus on things that we feel. And in fact, that there is no objective reality out there. Everything is interpretation, the notion of narrativizing reality. And so these ones argues these ones that if you cannot measure it, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory. These ones accuse these ones of being too conservative and invested in the status quo. And that the thing is not just to study reality and explain it, but it is much more important to change it. Let me finish by making one statement, that again also political science has been a victim of oppression and dismissal by the powers that be. For a long time, political scientists have been tormented. They have been chased around. They have ended up in exile. In Kenya, where I come from, the political science department had to change name in order to survive. So political scientists have suffered. And that is why perhaps we have the crisis that we are talking about. Thank you for listening to me.